So unlike all our videos up to this point, this video falls under CineCringe, not because it's a bad movie, but because it's extremely difficult to watch. My name is George, and Chris, what are we doing today?
The 2008 film Martyrs, a horror movie written and directed by Pascal Laugier. Actual pronunciation may differ.
When I was looking for this movie, I found the 2015 remake of it as well. I made it about 30 minutes in and I gave up because it was so boring.
It's an American remake, right?
Yeah, the 2015 American remake has a 9% rating and it absolutely is justified. I mean, it is about 9% as good as this original. But the 2008 version, which is what we're talking about, is actually a really good film.
Laugier said that his intention with Martyrs was to make a film that would be transgressive even for hardcore horror fans, not simply to make a horror film for horror fans.
You know, word of warning for anybody who is curious about this movie: if you do not have a strong stomach, just be careful. It's a rough one.
Caroline braved this movie with me, and as we were sitting down, she was like, "Should we make popcorn?" And I was like, "No."
I have a feeling a lot of this video is going to be blurred out. Because
Yeah.
there's no fucking way YouTube will let us show any of this. We'll try to describe what's happening the best as we can as we go.
So the plot is that in 1971, a young woman escapes from some sort of strange torture cult who we don't know too much about. Now 15 years older, she arrives at the doorstep of a seemingly normal suburban family and shotguns them all to death. We discover that she believes them to be the ones responsible for having held her in captivity 15 years ago. Subsequently, she turns out to be right, and is her best friend, who has been with her through all these difficult times, is recaptured by this same cult and becomes their new victim.
Yeah, and it's basically about an hour and a half of just gory torture. I mean, I already love the shot. The shot of just her running like this, the way that she's running, her gait, it already tugs at your emotions really, really well. For me, supernatural horror movies never really scared me, just because I simply don't believe in them and it doesn't really do anything for me. But horrors that are kind of based in reality and has this sort of sequence always gets me.
Yeah, it's totally
documented footage.
I think you're honestly like, these few minutes, they don't have any straight out horror in that, like, you know, it starts with her running away, and that's her running to freedom. She's safe now, and then she's now in freedom. And instead of watching horrific things happen, you're thinking about the horrific things that have happened, and then we follow this guy just looking through the spaces, and it's got this kind of true crime documentary feel to it. And I totally agree. It's like much scarier. This is something that continues for basically the entire first half of the movie, is that you're just so destabilized as to what's going on. This shot of the guy's face as he comes into frame is just such a striking portrait shot. These early moments, the cinematography really just sets the movie apart.
Here we see what looks like, I don't know, a geist or a ghoul kind of creature that's been following Lucy around and kind of torments her. I just wanted to point out how fucking cool this looks.
So then they pull yet another trick on us, which is that we open on yet another young woman running away, screaming in fear, and you're like, oh my god, like, this is just wall-to-wall horror. And then it's a total joke being played on us, where we realize it's actually just her brother chasing her.
Siblings fighting, yeah.
Siblings fighting. And right away now you're kind of on guard, because you realize the movie can do anything. And is going to keep pulling the rug out from under you.
In our other videos, we've made fun of bad movies for having, you know, dramatic wild swings in tones, and it kind of gives you emotional whiplash. This movie, in its first 15-20 minutes, also does that, but it does it in the right way with this family scene. Lucy, that we saw at the beginning, coming in and just guns down this whole family while they're having a nice simple breakfast. And they even did this breakfast scene in such a way where it feels like we're supposed to invest in this family.
Absolutely.
Because we're learning about their personalities and learning about what they like and don't like, and their, you know, sort of little day-to-day struggles, what they're facing, the teenage years, and all of those things over simple breakfast. And then they just die.
Yeah, horrifically. And I also want to point out, before we get away from this ill-fated family, the son here, the young son, is actually the feature film debut of Xavier Dolan, who is a Montreal filmmaker.
That's quite the entry to a career.
Yeah, no kidding.
This film, jeez.
Pascal Laugier would go on to direct a feature film that was shot just near my hometown in the interior called The Tall Man with Jessica Biel.
Interesting. Okay. Is it a sequel to Tall Girl, the Netflix original?
I believe that's believe they have a team up in the Tall Girl 3 is when they
The woman who escapes at the beginning, the victim that escapes at the beginning, somehow becomes the villain.
Yeah, and at this point you suddenly realize you have no one to root for. And I guess the other half of this we're talking about is she's not like this cold-faced Terminator gunning them down and enjoying it. It's this incredibly emotionally difficult moment for her. And right after they're dead, we're going to see this super tragic scene where she's like leaning over the corpses and saying, "Why did you do this to me?"
So then we get to this sequence where we see in more clear daylight this ghoul-esque character that's been tormenting Lucy this entire time throughout her entire life. And we see this ghoul character physically fight and seems to be trying to kill Lucy. This is the first part of the movie that I kind of disliked a little bit. Mm-hmm. It's because it's really showing the 2008-ness with the wild, shaky cam.
I mean, I guess all we can say is, like, if you go watch a bunch of movies from 2008, as far as shaky cam goes, this is definitely a lesser offender.
Yes.
But at the same time, yeah, I mean, it was a bad movement in film. What can we say? And I just, at this moment when it cut from all of the gruesomeness and mayhem, and then we cut just right back 15 years earlier into this disgusting cell and see everything. I really like, this is where the movie tipped into just like relentless. And I kept using the word relentless in my notes because there's not a single moment of lightness. It's just wall-to-wall brutality and violence.
But what we do see is how she escaped. And as she spits out the food that she doesn't want to eat, the person that's been tormenting her trips, breaks her ankle, and that gives Lucy the chance to run. But as she's escaping from this building, she runs into another room and sees another victim who's chained up and asking for help. In her frantic fear state, she chooses to go to run first and leave this poor woman behind. She's been haunted by the memory of that ever since.
This is much more of a horror nerd comment. This moment where she's killing the woman with a hammer to the head, there's one shot of the hammer striking the head and the head doesn't really move. And I just wanted to kind of point that out as what I felt was kind of like in the early stages of how CG was being used in horror, where you could do this incredibly and appallingly realistic look like what a hammer might actually look like hitting a human head. Along with everything that's so intense and crazy about this movie, this first half really does just deliver on a bunch of like great horror visuals and horror tropes. And nowhere more than it just has, two bloodied heroines who are in white tank tops that are stained with blood and they're beaten up, and now she's out in the rain, and it just all looks awesome. Like they're really cool looking sequences along with being really impactful. It's an incredible movie.
In this little moment, this is also a pivotal point in the film where had this accidental event not happened of the hammer falling through, the wall, there wouldn't have been a second half of the movie because very likely Anna would have just left.
And you saying that again just highlights how perfectly this has all the normal horror movie stuff.
Yeah.
Because that's a classic thing. I had a note right here, too, that this is one of the few times that I genuinely, watching a horror movie, was like, don't go in there! Turn around! I rarely get that feeling so strongly, but for Anna here in this moment, every fiber of me was screaming for her to just turn around and run to safety.
As she finds the secret basement, the secret dungeon of this family, and she walked past this gallery of pain, and we see what we can presume as, past victims. Again, it's this kind of shit that really, really gets me, just because of how documented history it looks.
Keep that documented history thing in mind, because I got thoughts once we get to the monologue. I was screaming at Anna not to go in here. Thank God she does go in here, because what she finds is that there is yet another captive. And just seeing this basement tells you about the horrors that have happened here. And that's brilliant production design and brilliant filmmaking. I think you could skip watching all of the straight up horror violent stuff in this and still scare yourself just by watching like these sequences of people walking through rooms. There are tons of horror movies that reveal the person chained up in the basement. Tons of comedy movies, even. It's in Harold and Kumar. And so the fact that they can do this after decades of this trope and it's so effective is really incredible.
Okay, So then we get to what I would say is probably the worst, most gruesome scene of the entire film, at least in my opinion. And it's Anna trying to remove this visor that's screwed and nailed into or stapled into this victim's head. She removes what, like 2 or 3 of the staples and then just kind of rips the rest
Oh
off.
my god, that moment.
And just chunks of flesh. I can't show any of those on YouTube, right? So I'm gonna have to just describe it. And the best I can think of is it looked like trying to separate a grilled cheese, and you get the stringy the cheese, except you replace the stringy cheese with just melting flesh and pustules.
You should be writing horror, George. It's very evocative.
Which reminds me, if you're interested in listening to the full-length discussion of this episode, you can find it on our Patreon. The link is on screen and in the description down below. If you go over there, you will get the entire recording in an audio format like a podcast. Check it out, support us, help us keep doing this. We really appreciate it. Anyways.
You know, there are those great moments in gore movies where you're cringing, but you're kind of cringing in a satisfied way. Because it's gross, but you're kind of going, hee, that's gross. Don't show that to me. But this was one where you're just legitimately like, please don't show any more of this to me. I don't want to be watching this anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I got nauseous watching this a little bit. This sequence, it was gross. All right, let's move on from this.
You convinced me. She's rubbing her head against the wall. Suddenly she gets shot out of nowhere. You don't even know what happened. And again, you're just like, how can this continue? How can more things happen to these people?
Surprisingly, from this point on, it gets much worse.
Cannot overstate, the first half is the fun half. We introduce Mademoiselle, who seems to be like the leader of this cult organization. And finally, everything in the movie kind of falls into place because she does a big monologue that essentially explains everything. She explains that this cult has been in operation for 17 years, and she says they're much more organized now, so an escape like Lucy would never happen again. She reveals that, well, most people are victims. There are some rare people who are what she calls martyrs, and she shows Anna a series of pictures of people who she believes essentially attained a sort of enlightenment or saw beyond in the moments before their death. This is where we get yet more of icky connection to like real world historical events and just real world feeling that you've been talking about, George.
If a person experiences enough pain, they will eventually gain an ability to glimpse into the afterlife. It's it's basically Deadpool without the comedy.
They're talking about martyrdom, they're talking about gaining powers, but they don't see themselves as involved in like magic or spirituality or anything like that. They see themselves as being part of a scientific pursuit.
I don't know why. It just made me thought of the rat utopia experiment. For about 18 minutes, Anna is repeatedly beaten, tormented, and fed what looks like a mixture between, I don't know, polenta and smegma. It just continues. She just force-fed and then beaten and force. Rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat.
When you say rinse and repeat, you can't overstate how much the movie just drags you through this. There's a long, long sequence that has no dialogue. At no point does she try to escape. At no point does she make more than a tiny half-hearted effort to fight back. At no point is there any of the normal beats where, she might try to connect with her captors, or her captors might say something, or something might be revealed. There is no forward plot momentum.
And you're watching a person surrender.
Any other movie, I think anyone else would have just done a time cut to her with a shaved head and a scene showing that she had surrendered. This movie makes us surrender with her, essentially. It's incredible to watch, and it doesn't feel like a horror movie at this point. It feels like something deeper and darker.
So finally we get to can we use a different word than climax? I can't think of any other word.
We get to the last stage of the cult's plan.
Where Anna is flayed entirely, head to toe.
I don't have much to say. This is obviously one of the images that's been in my mind since I watched this movie 14 years ago. I talked earlier about how there was no dialogue for a long time in the sequence where she was being beaten. And I think the final kind of culmination of that idea that we've gone past speech into this just brutal, primal relationship of victim and victimizer. She doesn't even cry out. She doesn't even make a sound. The last hammer strike on my heart after everything we've been through.
There's a shot here that shows, and again, I can't use this, but I'll describe it, right? There's a wide shot of Host flaying, and you just basically see her entire body, all her muscles and veins and flesh and tendons exposed.
It looks just like a biology textbook.
That shot, to me, I know it's supposed to be the most shocking shot, but it actually reached a point where it's so outside of anything I have any point of reference to that it didn't shock me as much as previous scenes, if that makes sense. And instead, it kind of just made me thought of, like, I don't know, a Titan from Attack on Titan.
It's not like you're looking at the pain of a human, almost.
Do you enjoy pain?
Pain don't hurt.
Full body flaying is so outside of reach for what I can imagine that I kind of disconnected a little bit.
You said disconnected. That's what happens in the movie. She is disconnected from this pain as well.
And we see that disconnect because as this incredibly cool shot of just zooming into her eyes, we see that she's reached what they believe to be martyrdom. And the camera zooms into her eye and goes past it, and we kind of get a glimpse, swirling lights and so on. So what do you think this is supposed to be?
I think this is a culturally agreed on way of representing the intangible beyond of transcendence. I can think of a lot of movies that have this image. I can think of a lot of drug users that talk about seeing this image.
And instead of announcing what she's learned, the cult leader shoots herself in the bathroom.
She does pass on one little bit of wisdom. She says, can you imagine what you might see after death? And he says no, and she says, keep wondering. If nothing else, it sounds as though she has learned something that she thinks others would be better off not learning. But that could also be not true. That could be that she just wants to keep it to herself, because let's be honest, she doesn't seem like a very nice person.
I did go on a bit of a rabbit hole, right? Just sort of reading everybody's interpretation of this ending. And there's a lot. I like to think what Anna finds out is that the club is full, so to speak.
Right.
No one is actually allowed in. What Madame Roussel is left with is just guilt of all the immeasurable suffering that she's caused.
Another point is even we don't even know if Lucy told the truth to Mademoiselle.
That too, yeah. She could just be fucking.
We don't get to hear what she said. She probably rickrolled her. Mademoiselle's like, oh fuck. All right.
It's all up to interpretation, audience. If you choose to watch this movie, let us know what you think it is, because
tell us how it's positive. Explain that to us. That would be great. So I'm interested in how you think this might like subvert the horror genre. Even if you could get some like straightforward like pulp horror enjoyment out of the first half, there's no way anyone was like all in on enjoying the second half of this movie. It's not like it doesn't give the fun kicks that horror movies give.
Unlike pretty much all horror movies, there really isn't a central main character. There is no happy ending. Nobody escapes. There isn't the lone survivor girl who gets out because she's at the beginning and then she dies in the middle.
It starts with the final girl. You're right.
It takes what a normal horror movie's sequential event, cuts it in half, and put the second half at the beginning. The first half of the movie, which would normally be a traditional horror movie's second and third act, almost felt like an introduction of a primer to get you ready for the real shit that happens in the second half, where it goes, you want to see how deep this rabbit hole really goes.
Second half starts with a monologue that explains to you everything that's going to happen, and then it just happens with no surprises. So we go from this incredibly like chaotic and destabilized first half to a second half that has no tricks for you.
By the end of the film, it gave me muscle fatigue, if that makes sense.
It makes sense because it happened to me too.
Yeah, rating. So what do you think? I don't know. I have no idea how to rate this.
If this sounds like something you would enjoy, I would honestly put this movie like above a 9 out of 10. If you have even the slightest inkling that you couldn't handle it, I'm going to tell you it's a 1 out of 10 and you shouldn't watch it.
And if you do end up braving this, please, please, please tell us your experience. We really want to hear it. That concludes this episode on Martyrs. What are we doing next week? Next week we are talk about whiplash on tonal change. We're doing the influencer-based movie Airplane Mode.
Yes. Is his first name Paul or is Logan? Logan Paul?
No,
Logan?
actually, it stars both Logan and Jake Paul.
No!
Double the awful. And a bunch of other people that I've never heard of, but is likely worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
I didn't know there were two Pauls.